And in a sense, I'm going to speak somewhat unconventionally about icons, but with a sense of reverence and respect, because of a sense of how the iconic has, for me, permeated my understanding of many topics, be that the apophatic, the nature of images, of the mystical, and of the contemplative life. Hadi, would you mind? Thank you. And there's something I wanted really to say in terms of my subject about our relationship to this illusionistic culture, if you like, of digital culture, and how, looking at the icon, we see a window, if you like, to divine ascent, theosis, a revelation, if you like, of invisible realities, invisible forms. And how, of course, I think in theosis, in a sort of divinization, the human being and images are iconically interconnected. Having been made in the image of God, man, if you like, ascends or can ascend to a greater likeness through a longing for the beautiful or for the good. And one thing I want to touch on in my theme is this idea that there's something about our creative capacities that is a crucial vehicle for this ascent and for this process. Because I think in the appreciation and in the creation of a work of art, there's a means by which we become more than ourselves and in a sense united to God. And so in this sense, I want to say that the work of art is a kind of exteriorization of the shaping of the deiform soul. I think my topic today could be summarised in this remarkable quotation from the poet and Orthodox theologian Philip Sherard, the translator into English of the 5 volumes of the Philokalia. He said, "By virtue of the fact that man is created in the image of God, he is also a creator, a maker, an artist. Indeed, this is his distinguishing role, that which is capable of making him holy." So here for Sherard, this is distinctly important. And I want to discuss in this respect a kind of double nature of iconicity. For the icon or the image is a likeness that refers both to the mysterious material quality of created images, but also of the resemblance of the human soul to God. Paul Levdemikov said, "The best icon of God is man." And so we've talked a little and we understand iconography is a distinct part of the liturgy and of course honed through distinct practices and prayer. And the icon in this respect isn't bound by the same changing conventions as broader artistic culture, and nor, as we've discussed in some ways, does it necessarily represent the subjectivity of the artist in so far as there's a certain kind of inspiration. Iconic art is an art drawn from the invisible world. But thinking about Sherard's point, and insofar as we can all venerate, appreciate icons for their beauty and meaning, of course not all of us are artists, nor are we iconographers. And there are, of course, different dimensions to faith and how we understand images and how they form part of our lives. But I think what Sherard says about man being a creator, if you like, a maker or an artist, has some truth for everyone. And if you could please change the slide. This is St. Gregory Palamas. The human soul is something great and wondrous, superior to the entire world. It overlooks the universe and has all things in its care. It is capable of knowing and receiving God, and more than anything else has the capacity of manifesting the sublime magnificence of the master craftsman. So there's this sense that there is a sort of quality, a creative capacity in man that derives from this contemplation of the divine. And I'm interested in this respect how creativity or imagination is in some respects connected to the idea of theosis. Change the slide, please. And I'm going to focus on a kind of purposive creativity, I suppose, which I think is iconographical, but not in the strict sense of making icons. because following Sherard, I'd like to talk about what I think is the iconicity common to all kinds of truly spiritual art. And I think particularly in increasingly secular and what we could say non-traditional cultures of the West, it's possible and perhaps even necessary for an artist or some artists to make a spiritual art that draws upon certain principles of iconicity, whilst not, of course, desecrating the icon as a unique form of divinely inspired art. And so as a visual artist myself, I want to discuss this theme through, if you like, the wisdom of the iconic tradition. And insofar as I think this tradition deeply informs a way of thinking about art as a form of symbolic participation and of revelation. The slide I've just had on the screen is from the John Climacus of the Ladder of Divine Ascent. In the text he says, "Ascend, my brothers, ascend eagerly, let your heart's resolve be to climb." And this figure is a beginning of a sort of sketch of a idea or intuition in something I've begun working on in recent months, and it's something that appeared to me, if you like, from a kind of contemplative vision. It was drawn, came out in a kind of instantaneous action, emerged, if you like, from the darkness during a moment of deep contemplation. And I saw its shape and then in a sense attempted to render it into a kind of form of visual representation. If you could change the slide. And here, you know, the motion is upwards, the arms outstretched. And again, please, Hadi. And it was in writing this paper and thinking about these things that I began to study and think about how images which in a sense had come to me in a way intuitively shared a kind of symbolic form or shape, if you like, with the symbolic traditions in icons and other religious art. And so I think there's an argument or an idea that in this age of ours, we require or need to think about art forms that transcend their historical milieu. And we have the icon, of course, to consider, but also forms which in some respect respond to the times as well. And a caveat to this, I would say, is that this doesn't mean that modern art, such as digital art, should only be determined by the particularities of a moment. And I think this is a mistake made by a lot of modern artists. But of course, that like the icon in a way, art should draw upon a kind of changeless and eternal vision. But this is a vision, I think, that can be channeled also through the media and communication of the modern world. And I think importantly, we face new kinds of challenges, I suppose, with artificial intelligence, simulation and images. But there's a wisdom in the iconographic tradition which we can draw upon and learn from, a tradition which, of course, contains an ancient wisdom that's always given us the means to deal with true and false images and to make those distinctions. And in this way, what's common to all art which has a kind of iconographical bearing is that when there's a proper spiritual vision, it's an image of the truth. I'm sorry, if you just go back. And I want to explore these themes through some of my own artistic interests. I'll refer to some sections of scripture briefly, and this idea, this creative aspect of becoming the likeness of God. I'll discuss the distinction in some orthodox theology around the difference between the image and the likeness. I want to allude to the idea of inspiration, which we've heard about a little, as a kind of vehicle for creative energies. The akeropoieton, the image made without hands, as an idea that the artist is a vehicle or transmission for vision. And then I want to cover a little of Sherard's views on what he called broadly the Platonic view of art, a sense of the iconographical that he said, again, although speaking strictly from an orthodox perspective, he understood to be common to all truly spiritual cultures. So Sherard said that the purpose of the Christian way is the divinization of man. Thus Genesis, so that God created man in his own image, in the image of God created him. St. Peter, we are partakers of the divine nature. St. Paul, behold, in the glory of the Lord, we are being changed into his likeness, ekona, from one degree of glory to another. And the writings of the Philokalia, as I mentioned, that Sherard translated, variously describe the way in which we are images of God's energies in a sense, but not of his unknowable essence, and of which no image can be made. If you could get the slide, please. So this is St. Diadochos of Photiki, 5th century. All men are made in God's image, but to be in his likeness is granted only to those who through great love have brought their own freedom into subjection to God. Our likeness to God requires our cooperation. When the intellect begins to perceive the Holy Spirit with full consciousness, we should realise that grace is beginning to paint the divine likeness over the divine image in us. This remarkable image, the painting the likeness over the image. If you could change the slide, please. I'm sorry, back again. There's another remarkable quote. He says, in portraiture, when the full range of colours is added to the outline, the painter captures the likeness of the subject. Something similar happens to those who are being repainted by God's grace in the divine likeness. When the luminosity of love is added, then it is evident the image has been fully transformed into the beauty of the likeness. So this wonderful sense in which there's a certain inherent nature of being an image, but a sense that perhaps through a sort of theosis one can become more like. And one other quote here from Nikatos de Thasos. Our intellect is an image of God, hence it loves to dwell among things proximate to God and seeks to unite itself with him from whom it had its origin, by whom it is activated and towards whom it ascends by means of its natural capabilities, and it desires to imitate him in his compassion and simplicity. Slide, please. And so art, as we've heard, is a vision that derives from the eternal. Here an example of the Mandylion icon, the trace of Christ's face, an archeron poeton, an image made without hands. And the contemplative artist, whilst using skill and dexterity in their hands to paint, to edit, to shape, is also making an image without hands in a sense, insofar as they are a vehicle for divine vision, that is to say they are inspired. And this accords with a broadly Platonic view of art. So if you change the slide, please. Here in the Timaeus, the craftsman produces beautiful things by looking at what is changeless as his model. And Plotinus, that the artist looks to invisible realities to produce visible things, in doing so adding to nature through inspired vision. And so the artist, we could think about in terms of this material and spiritual quality, can draw upon a kind of double vision of invisible and invisible realities, visible and invisible realities, to produce a work of spiritual art. Through contemplation, he looks with a noetic vision to the unknowable, to the invisible, and makes impressions of things. And through attention to the beauty of the person or to nature, he sees God's theophany in the sensible world. And so perhaps there's a kind of combination of an inner noetic vision and an outer sensuous vision which unite in art iconically, representing to differing degrees a likeness of the divine. Looking to the visible world, we see beyond to another invisible world. And looking inside, there's an intelligible world in whose images we perceive intimations of the invisible. The inner and outer movement of this visibility and invisibility constitutes a kind of creative act of theosis. Sherard again says, by raising his intelligence towards intelligible realities and by apprehending or intuiting them in his inner vision, the artist will allow the radiations of their presence to flow into and inform his work. Slide, please. This from Losky Holy images express things in themselves invisible and render them really present, visible and active. They are a material centre in which there reposes an energy, a divine force which unites itself to human art. Sherard, I think, was a writer who wrote very beautifully on icons and theosis and their connection in the role of imagination. The whole of creation, he said, by virtue of the divine seeds intrinsic to and indwelling in all creatures, constitutes the church and is God's icon, his epiphany. In human beings and all creatures, the church is latent, unrealised, waiting to be revealed. And for Sherard, man and the religious images he makes form a interpenetrative and participatory whole. The ideas and the beliefs that the icon represents, he says, slide please, must be regarded not merely as static and abstract concepts, but as living realities. So the image is a living reality, centre of power within man as well as in the universe. The icon projects these states into visible forms. It is an image of these states and is imbued with something of the vitality of what it images. So there's the sense here of the presence of the image. So this sense then is that icons or images are not mere representations, as man is not mere nature. Both are active, epiphanic realities that interconnect the visible, the invisible, the earthly and the divine. Again, please. An image, says Sherard, is not simply a sign for something. It does not simply indicate something other than itself. An image shares in the nature of the object of which it is an image. There is an actual presence of the one in the other, a physical fusion, not confusion, so that in knowing the image, we are in the same instant made aware of the object which it reveals. And an image does not, as a sign, merely indicate, it also brings about the effect it indicates. It compels us, to the degree to which we submit or are receptive to its influence, actually to experience that life which it mysteriously mirrors and enshrines. So here we see this function of the image, its vehicle as a form of theosis, and of theophany, of God's creation, and of humans being made in the image of God. And so thus in creative activity, the person realises a kind of wholeness and in a sense honours the eternal act of creation, reaching beyond the temporal sphere of art to ascend to that which is beyond time. Because I think it must be remembered that this sense of the original act of creation, as it were, does not take place along a temporal axis of being, but is rather an emanation of God in every moment, on a vertical axis, if you will, of the higher to the lower, the participation of the latter in the former. And the icon becomes a sort of nexus for this relation of time and eternity, if you will. Back to an image I briefly showed a detail of earlier. Losky makes a very interesting remark that images are a kind of ladder of theophanies. They serve a guiding, initiatory, heuristic purpose perhaps, but are nevertheless ultimately inadequate to represent God, the apophatic. But it's here that one comes to appreciate a certain nature and function of images, words or music, and even though in a sense they are somehow only shadows, they do contain a presence, and they presence God, if you like, in a form that is suited to our understanding where words fail. St. Simeon, the new theologian, having climbed every step of the ladder, they draw near to him, dwell with him, and enjoy his ineffable blessings. This is the imagery of Jacob's dream. A ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. In his commentary on dreams, Philo of Alexandria comments that this dream is the kind in which our own mind, moving out of itself together with the mind of the universe seems to be possessed and God-inspired, and so capable of receiving some foretaste and foreknowledge of things to come. And so there's a sense in which we climb upwards through images, through art, through poetry, through the love of beauty, and abandoning to some extent and putting aside all that we know or think that we know. And this, as the author of The Cloud of Unknowing puts it, is the move between the cloud of forgetting what we suppress below us, the sensible images that we encounter, and the cloud of unknowing, which stands above us. We move into this liminal space between. And it's only then that we see, with a kind of vision that we can transmit back into the sensible world. And these expressions of beauty, ascent and journey towards God, such as the ladder, are of course painted in the language of images. Today's world of digital culture has perhaps exacerbated a historical problem with our understanding of the true and the false, and saturated us with images. And so we might ask, what kind of role do modern forms of art play in our understanding of the religious imagination and the spiritual life today? How do these ideas stand in relation to the iconic tradition and to some of the other traditions we've discussed? In respect to my own work, I began as a filmmaker, and I've worked with analogue or traditional processes, if you like, with printing, with drawing, as well as more modern techniques in terms of digital computers and so on. And I use drawings, I then digitize them, I edit things with software. And there's a tendency, I suppose, to speak today about virtuality in our relation to media. And this often implies another kind of world in which we feel immersed. And it's often generally considered as a kind of favourable excursion from the mundanity of the real world. But of course, works of sacred or spiritual art achieve this profound sense of the virtual in a contemplative sense, and in a very different sense, enriching our experience of the real and the visible through intimations of the invisible. And so the works I've been thinking about very recently have emerged from a kind of impulse, if you like, to channel these ideas of spiritual vision and likeness I've mentioned to, if you like, challenge this rise of the virtual world. And by using this kind of media to work with light as a material in a very particular way, to, if you like, exploit and use the new possibilities of this technology to reach this message in outwards into a very screen-based culture. I'd like to just conclude with a thought from Sherard on the role of the artist who's not an iconographer, and what role they might play in society alongside those forms of art that continue in a religious tradition. Art for Sherard is a reflection of the image that forms self and society, and the worldview of that society is what determines the shape of the artwork it expresses. And thus, in cultures that reduce humans to machines, the resulting art will be of a kind that further fragments and distances us from the divine. Sherard says, "As everything rightly seen mirrors the eternal, and as everything rightly seen is a symbol of a higher level of reality, a work of art may use a symbolism little related to that of a traditional liturgical art, and may still act as a bridge between the material and the spiritual, earth and heaven, and may still possess a sacred quality and function. An artist whose intention and attention is concentrated on the discovery and expression of spiritual principles within and without may well be given moments of revelation and illumination, intimations and intuitions of eternity, and so transfigure the material of his art with that beauty and rhythm which are the hallmark of the sacred." And so if an artist can shape their spirit through the presence of a kind of iconographical vision, and see themselves as a participant in or partaker of the divine nature. And if an artist is operating within the constraints of a non-traditional culture, then I think it's possible to consider that there is a sense in which their art should be iconographical, insofar as it has the sense of a living presence and energy of creation. In this way, I'd like to say that the long-standing and beautiful tradition of iconography, and what I think I've called this iconographical attitude in non-traditional art, can together communicate spiritual mysteries. As the author of The Cloud of Unknowing writes, he fits himself exactly to our souls by adapting his Godhead to them, and our souls are fitted exactly to him by the worthiness of our creation after his image and likeness. And so in Theosis or in homoiosis, we become like God, but perhaps we've become distracted insofar as in culture, modern culture, we become more like the false images of technology. And the digital age, I suppose, is one of a kind of accelerated novelty, but I think without a grounding in a tradition, this novelty is depthless. And I think what we learn from ideas of likeness and iconicity are that the true meaning of originality or invention is to mirror higher ideas, both in forms pursuant to a tradition and in active forms that are in some sense symbolically consistent but also particular to an age, so that these ideas hold up a mirror to the troubling and uncertain virtualities of images in digital culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Questions for Gareth?
Thanks, Eric. I'll start with this one.
Mm-hmm.
There was this quotation you put up about the intellect being an icon of God, or something like that earlier on. I guess I have this slide.
Yeah, I know the one. Yeah. It's on there. Yeah, reasonably early on as Nikitas Theosis. Yeah.
Right there. Intellect is an image of God. So in this view, is it again it's kind of the intellect alone being an icon of God as opposed to the totality of the human being, or is here the intellect referring to something else, something that contains the essence of the entire human being as such, and not as a particular faculty? And I'm thinking about something that was mentioned in
Frederick's paper, yes. Yeah, I recall what the section we were talking. Yeah.
And that was one question, and it perhaps related to was what makes an icon an icon? Is it's so we've heard about various forms of consecration or preservation of icons, without which they're merely works of art, like mundane works of art without any power or any divine quality in them. So is it the consecration, or is it any physical attributes in the way it's drawn, in its style? What is it that makes it really an icon, gives it that sacred quality, which you mentioned, these two beautiful citations from Lasky and Sherard about how icons actually contain its materiality that contains and transmits that divine energy. So if you could comment on that one.
Yes, well, this is your first question, of course, as we heard, and as I think has been alluded to in different ways in some of the other papers. This is a area perhaps of philosophical and theological dispute. The range of quotes, mostly though not all from the Philokalia that I cited, range from the 5th to the 14th centuries. So on the one hand there are some repetitive and consistent ideas. In other respects there's differences as to whether this refers, if you like, to the totality of the person, as it were, or to particular qualities like the intellect. I suppose a short answer is I don't know in this respect, but the idea, I think, that someone like Sherard tries to encourage, if you like, is that there is some sense in which not only our intellect, if you like, our ability to think or reason, as it were, but our experience, our whole person, partakes in some way in this divine nature. So I think this is why he so closely sees this as being threatened, if you like, by the instrumental nature of the modern world, because not only does it suppress or divide or sunder the nature of the person in terms of reducing them to a cog in the machine or a number, as it were, it strips them in some respects of their total capacity, their sensible and, if you like, noetic capacities to become divine.
Yes.
So I wouldn't want to comment so far as I'm not an expert on it, on the finer points of the theological questions around the nature of intellect and likeness, but I would certainly say that it seems to me that in the modern context, this speaks to a very interesting point about, which I think as well one can see further accelerated by or fantasized about in some respects in terms of computers and machines, that there's this sort of mind-body dualism, that the mind, or whatever you want to call it in that nomenclature, becomes something that can be, you know, uploaded or virtual or something like this. So this sense of the whole person, you know, I mean, in a sense alluded to partly in the Theanthropos figure of Christ in the Sinai icon, is divided, I suppose. But interestingly, in that respect as well, this is where this something that the professor referred to in the introductory remarks yesterday. When we're talking about this idea of the material and the spiritual, how are we understanding their interplay or their interaction? And this seems to be another important dimension leading on to your second question about this quality of the artwork. Now, I think what I've tried to argue and what I've said is that, and as we've heard as well, that there are, of course, very particular properties to the consecration and recognition, if you like, of a genuinely iconic work of art, perhaps one that performs a particular liturgical function and so on, that's part of a church or so forth. To my mind, how we recognise sacred qualities in other kinds of art is part of the question I was trying to get at, because I think that in some respects we understand or have talked about and perhaps have a clearer sense of what that means in a sense of the traditions of icon painting. And again, I won't make pretensions to being an expert on this, but this is my understanding. But how do we perceive this quality? How do we recognise this quality in, let's say, other types of spiritual art? Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, this sense of the intention, purpose, and cultivation of a kind of certain attitude to the work's making forms a part of that. But in a sense where the icon, and in Sherard's understanding of, well, of course, is understood within the wholeness of a religious culture, there's a certain sense in which that understanding is immanent to the culture, and so in some senses is given, but that's not given in the second sense of what a spiritual art could be or is. And to my mind, this is something which is an ongoing problem or search to understand, if you like. And again, perhaps even despite the sense that I have spoken, if you like, quite openly about my own approaches to this, this isn't to say, of course, that I necessarily can see or recognise that in my own images, and perhaps some of you do, some of you don't. So there's also this sense of that outward nature of that work and how it does, Well, I think part of it's to do with the separation of the maker from the object as part of that intention. And, well, this question of reception, which I guess has become more distributed and fragmented by the technology. So I don't really know the full answer to that second question in particular, but I think that it's something which is an issue I think I've tried to get at, and one that I've thought a lot about.
Yeah, thank you. And it just occurred to me while you were speaking that intellect here could be a transition of nous.
Yeah.
In which case it's not quite. It's not
quite so.
The faculty.
Yeah.
As other. Thank you.
And could one say that there's been looking at the longue durée, there's been a sort of increasing subjectivization and disenchantment of the artwork, in the sense that if you look at very ancient objects in a museum that are presented as artworks, they're usually in a Sitzenleben that was essentially sacred, usually, and that in a way, the development of the museum or the place in which an artwork is displayed is usually a very modern development, and particularly in the Western world.
Well, I mean, we've spoken a little about this tradition in respect of the idealist philosophy in German thought, and I suppose part of that connects to Hegel's idea about the shifting role of art, I suppose, historically, moving to what he calls the romantic phase, which effectively is a kind of hyper-individualized, subjective form of making art, where all possibilities are open to the artist, except that now has become divorced, if you like, from art's spiritual function. And it also made me think a little of Benjamin's idea of the auratic, that the aura or presence of an object in time and space. And here, in your example of the museum, this is the object stripped of its auratic concept and placed in a cabinet or a display alongside others. So,
because if the point of the art is the durchscheinende Idee, I mean, just to use Hegel's, the shining forth of the idea, then it's hard to see what Andy Warhol's Brillo pad is doing. Let's take a rather extreme example.
Well, I suppose Hegel would say that this is an art that's reached the romantic stage, and so it's bereft of any need to represent anything higher than its status as an object, in a way.